It is a little after 7 in the evening, in the year 700, on a fjord somewhere along the coast of what is now called Norway, and the fog is rolling in low over the water, the way it does most evenings this time of year, soft and grey, smelling of salt and wet stone and the faint sweetness of peat smoke drifting down from a turf roof further up the shore. Get yourself comfortable before we go any further tonight. Dim the lights if you can. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw unclench. Let whatever the day just handed you stop mattering for a while. You do not have to do anything for the next few hours except listen, and if your eyes close before we are finished, good. That is not a failure of this story. That is exactly what it is for. Tonight we are going somewhere very old and very quiet. Not a battlefield. Not a longship cutting through open water with a carved prow and a crew of raiders. Just a fjord at dusk. A family finishing their work for the day, and a hearth that has been burning since before any of them woke this morning. There is a household in a timber longhouse near the water tonight, and in a little while we are going to step through their door, sit down close to their fire, and stay until every one of them is asleep. Before we do that, I want to tell you why this particular evening, in this particular place, has been on my mind for months, and why archaeologists on the other side of a fjord not far from our family, right now, in our own century, are digging carefully into a burial mound and finding a ship inside it. A ship built for someone who lived in the same world, breathed the same salt air, and never once called himself a Viking. Because that word and everything it would come to mean belonged to his grandchildren, not to him. The fire in our longhouse tonight is small and orange, and it throws its light across an earthen floor packed hard by generations of bare feet. Somewhere behind a partition wall, a cow shifts her weight and sighs. Outside, waves the height of your hand are folding themselves quietly onto a beach made of smooth stones. Over and over, the way they will fold themselves onto that same beach long after everyone in this story has been dust for 1,000 years. We will get to all of it. The people, the food, the wool on the spindle, the myths whispered to children who are trying very hard to stay awake. For now, just breathe. Feel the room around you settle the way that fjord is settling into its own darkness. And when you are ready, let us go inside. Tonight we are going to spend an entire day, start to finish, inside the life of a coastal farming family in Norway in the year 700, roughly 13 decades before anyone in Scandinavia sailed a ship to a foreign monastery with violence on their mind. We will wake before dawn in a longhouse on a fjord, follow the milking and the fishing and the grinding of grain, sit through a midday meal, and end, the way every one of these evenings ended, with a fire banked down to coals and a house full of sleeping people. If you already have a picture in your head of what this century looked like on this coastline, it probably involves a dragon-headed prow slicing through fog, or a monastery in flames, or a horned helmet that, I will tell you now, never actually existed outside of 19th century opera costumes. None of that belongs here. The events that gave the Viking Age its name, the raid on Lindisfarne, the ships crossing open water toward England and Francia, are still roughly 90 years in the future from where we are standing tonight. The family we are about to meet will never see a single one of those ships leave, and neither will their children. What we are visiting instead is the ordinary, unhurried, deeply competent life that came before all of that. The life that in some ways made it possible, though nobody living it had any idea what was coming. This is not a story about what these people would eventually become. It is a story about who they already were. A farming and fishing household on a fjord, spinning wool by a peat fire, telling their children stories about spirits in the mountains and the sea, and going to sleep night after night, in a world that felt to them exactly as permanent and exactly as ordinary as your own world feels to you right now. We know a surprising amount about this life, not from anything these people wrote down, because they left us no writing at all, but from the ground itself. from longhouse foundations pressed into the soil of hundreds of farms across the Norwegian coast. From a boat pulled out of a bog near Kvalsund a little over a century ago, built in almost exactly this period, that shows us how these people moved across water before the ships got their keels and their sails. From graves, full of tools and beads and the bones of the people who used them. And from one mound, on the island of Leka, that archaeologists have only in the last couple of years confirmed holds a ship burial from this same narrow window of history. Evidence that even in this quiet, pre-raiding world, some families along this coast were already accumulating the kind of wealth and status that would, generations later, help fund the ships that made the raids possible. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of evening that suits you, an unhurried visit to a world most people never think to picture clearly, I would be grateful if you would take a moment to subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel keep finding the sources and building the evenings that make nights like this one possible. If you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are tonight, and what time it reads on your clock right now. I read every one, and it is a strange, quiet pleasure to know how many different corners of the world are settling in at the same moment for the same story. Wherever you are, whatever hour it happens to be, I am glad you decided to spend it here. So, let us leave the 21st century where it is for a while. It will still be there when we get back. The year is 700. The place is a fjord on the western coast of what will one day be called Norway, though nobody standing on its shores tonight has ever heard that name and never will. The fog is thickening over the water now, and somewhere up the slope from the beach, a family is banking their fire a little higher against the coming cold, because the light is almost gone, and the evening, their evening, is only just beginning. The fjord holds its cold the way certain people hold a grudge, quietly, completely, and without any special hurry to let go of it. Even in the warmer months, the water rarely climbs much above what a modern hand would call frigid, fed as it is by mountain snowmelt and glacial rivers that never fully forget what season it actually is up in the high country, whatever the calendar might claim down here at sea level. Tonight, in the gathering dark of a summer evening slipping toward autumn, that cold rises off the water in a fog thick enough to blur the far shore into a smudge of grey-green, thick enough that the mountains behind the farm have vanished entirely, leaving only their lower slopes visible, dark with spruce and pine, dropping straight into black water. This is a world built almost entirely from wood, stone, turf, and water, and it announces itself to every sense before you ever see a single person in it. The smell arrives first, layered and specific in a way that a modern nose, dulled by exhaust and plastic and central heating, has to work a little to fully register. There is salt, obviously, the mineral tang that clings to everything within half a mile of a fjord. Underneath that, wet stone and wetter earth, the specific mineral smell of a beach made from smooth, fist-sized rocks polished by 10,000 years of tide. And rising above both of those, unmistakable and warm, the smell of peat smoke, rich and a little bitter, curling up from turf roofs scattered along the shoreline and hanging in the fog like something you could almost reach out and hold. If you walked this shoreline tonight, and you would need good boots and better balance, because there are no roads here, only paths worn into the grass and mud by centuries of bare and booted feet, you would find a scatter of farms strung along the water's edge at distances that feel, to modern eyes, oddly generous. This is not a village in the sense that later centuries will understand the word. There is no central square, no shared well, no church, because there will be no church here for another 300 years at the earliest. Instead, there are individual farmsteads, each built around a single long timber building that serves as house, barn, workshop, and storeroom all at once, separated from its nearest neighbor by a walk of perhaps 10 or 15 minutes along the shore. close enough for help to arrive quickly in an emergency, far enough that each household manages its own patch of land, its own boats, its own animals, its own fate. The buildings themselves are called longhouses, and the name undersells them slightly, because a longhouse is not simply a long house. It is an entire philosophy of shelter, built by people who understood, with a precision we have mostly lost, exactly what an 8-month winter demands of a structure. The walls are built from timber, oak where oak can be had, pine and spruce where it cannot. The logs set upright or laid horizontally depending on the local tradition, and packed at every seam with moss, clay and animal hair to close out the wind. The roof is the real engineering marvel, though nobody living under it would think to call it that. Birch bark is laid down first, overlapping like scales, waterproof and durable in a way that still surprises people who test it today, and over the bark goes turf, cut in thick blocks from the hillside and laid root side down so that the whole roof is, quite literally, a growing meadow held up on a wooden frame. In summer, grass and wildflowers sprout from the roofline. Goats, given half a chance, will climb up and graze there to the mild irritation and secret amusement of whoever owns them. Beneath one of these grassy roofs, right now, in the deepening fog, smoke is rising through a hole cut into the ridge, curling up and losing itself in the mist, which means somebody inside has just fed the fire. Step inside any one of these longhouses, in your imagination, before we settle on the one we are visiting tonight, and the interior logic reveals itself quickly. A single long room runs the building's full length, its earthen floor packed hard and swept clean. A central hearth burning down its middle rather than tucked against a wall, so that heat and light reach every corner equally. Raised wooden platforms run along both long walls, layered with straw, heavy wool and animal pelts, doubling as seating by day and sleeping benches by night. An arrangement that uses every square foot of a scarce, hard-won structure for at least two purposes at once. At one end, separated by a low wattle partition, the buyer holds whatever livestock the household can justify keeping close through the winter months. At the other end, storage, dried food, tools, the household's small stock of trade goods, kept dry and organized by whoever manages the household's stores. Nothing here is wasted space, because nothing about building and maintaining a structure like this one was ever cheap enough to waste. The economics of this coastline, if you can call something without coins economics, run on a different logic than the one your own life probably runs on. There is no currency here in the sense you would recognize, no minted coins changing hands for bread or ale. Value moves instead through weighed silver and iron, through direct trade of goods for goods, and above all through labor stored and converted into things that last. A length of well-woven wool cloth is wealth. A good iron knife is wealth. A skilled pair of hands is wealth, arguably the most valuable kind, because hands can keep producing more of everything else for as long as they remain healthy and willing. What does a family like this actually possess? Land, first, though land here means something closer to a right to use a given stretch of coast and hillside than to any deed or title in the modern sense. A claim recognized by neighbors and defended, when necessary, by custom rather than by paper. Livestock next, and livestock matters enormously here, because a cow or a handful of sheep represents both immediate sustenance in milk and wool, and a kind of walking savings account convertible into meat or trade goods when the situation demands it. Then, tools. Precious and irreplaceable in a world where iron has to be smelted from bog ore over days of careful, smoky labor before a blacksmith can even begin to shape it into something useful. And finally, cloth. More valuable than most modern people would ever guess, because every single length of it represents dozens, sometimes hundreds, of hours of human effort, from shearing to carding to spinning to weaving, all of it done by hand. All of it. In this household, as in most others along this coast, done primarily by women. To put a few rough figures on all of this, the way we might for any modern economy. A good milking cow, healthy and still producing well, represented something close to what a skilled boat builder might expect to earn across an entire working season of contracted labor. A serious investment for any household. A finished length of wool cloth long enough for a full garment could be traded for a decent iron tool, an axe head or a substantial knife. A rough equivalence that both sides of any such transaction understood instinctively without either party needing to write anything down. And a household's entire stock of dried salted fish, the product of months of fishing and preserving labor, represented, in the end, its single largest hedge against the very real possibility of a hard winter, the closest thing this farm has to savings held in a bank. There is no rent here in any modern sense, no landlord collecting payment for shelter. But there is an equally real cost paid instead in the constant maintenance every structure demands. The turf replaced, the timber checked for rot, the byre wall repacked against frost, an ongoing tax paid not in coin but in hours. A working farm along this fjord might trade dried fish, and there is a great deal of it, for iron tools forged inland, or for soapstone vessels quarried and carved further along the coast, remarkably durable cooking pots that could sit directly in a fire without cracking, unlike the clay alternatives. Amber, washed up along certain beaches after storms, might travel south through a chain of hands that stretches further than anyone in this household could imagine, eventually reaching markets on the European mainland where it commanded prices that would have startled the fisherman who first pocketed it, thinking little of a pretty stone. This is, and this is worth pausing over, already a connected world, threaded together by boats and by relationships stretching along hundreds of miles of coastline, even though nobody standing in this fog tonight has ever travelled further than perhaps a week's sail from where they were born. Down at the shoreline, close enough now that we could reach out and touch the nearest one. 3 boats have been hauled up onto the smooth stones and lie there in the fog like resting animals. They are clinker-built, meaning their planks overlap each other along the edges rather than sitting flush. A construction method that gives the hull a peculiar strength and flexibility, letting it bend with the waves instead of fighting them. If you have ever seen images of a Viking longship, elegant, high-prowed, built to cross open ocean, these boats are their humbler, more practical ancestors. No towering carved dragon head decorates the bow. No mast rises from the center, because these boats are rowed, not sailed, propelled by human muscle and oar rather than wind and canvas. The sail, that single innovation that will one day let these people's descendants cross open water to England and Iceland and eventually a coastline nobody here has any concept even exists on the other side of an ocean, has not yet arrived on this stretch of coast. It is still decades away. Tonight, and for the whole of this family's lives, a boat is something you row, something you know by the exact groan of its timbers and the specific way it answers when you lean into an oar stroke against a cross-current. These 3 boats belong to this household and to its 2 nearest neighbours, and their return to shore, hauled up well above the tide line and turned so their hulls face the weather, marks something like the closing bell of the working day along this whole stretch of coastline. When the boats are up, the fishing is done. When the fishing is done, the evening can properly begin. A dog trots along the tide line nearby. One of 2 the household keeps, part herder and part early warning system, nosing at a tangle of dried seaweed with the unhurried thoroughness of an animal that has already finished its own work for the day and is simply killing time before supper. Further along the shore, faint through the thickening fog, comes the sound of a second household finishing its own evening chores, a woman's voice calling something indistinct, the answering bark of a dog that is not this one, the dull knock of a wooden bucket set down on stone. Sound carries strangely across still water in fog like this, close and distant at once, so that a neighbour a quarter-mile off can feel, for a moment, as near as the next room, and then the wind shifts and the whole impression dissolves back into silence and mist. Follow the smell of that peat smoke now, up from the beach, along a worn path that climbs maybe 40 paces through wet grass, past a low stone wall built to keep livestock from wandering toward the water at night. And you arrive at a longhouse that sits with its long axis running roughly parallel to the shoreline, its turf roof already faintly luminous with the last grey light of the evening. This building is perhaps 60 feet from end to end and maybe 18 feet across, a scale that will seem modest until you understand everything a single roofline here is being asked to hold. Under this one roof lives an entire multi-generational household. Under this one roof also live, separated by nothing more than a wattle partition and the good sense to keep the buyer downwind of the sleeping benches, the animals whose body heat, on the coldest nights of a Norwegian winter, becomes an uncredited but essential part of the heating system. There is a single low doorway facing away from the prevailing wind, its lintel deliberately built low enough that anyone entering has to duck. A small daily ritual of humility built directly into the architecture, whether the builders intended it that way or simply built it to keep the heat in. And it is through this doorway, right now, with the fog thickening at our backs and the smell of peat smoke and roasting fish growing steadily stronger, that we are finally going to step inside and meet the family who has been waiting for us, without knowing it, this entire time. Her name is Thorhild, and if you had asked anyone on this stretch of coast tonight who ran this household, every single one of them, her husband included, would have told you the truth without hesitation. She is 34 years old, which by the standards of this century and this climate makes her a woman solidly in the middle of her adult life. Neither the newest bride on the fjord, nor yet the oldest grandmother, but the steady, capable centre around which an entire farm's daily rhythm turns. She was born on a farm 2 fjords south of here, the second daughter of a family with more children than land to comfortably support, and she came to this household at 19, married to a man named Ketil, in an arrangement negotiated between their 2 families the way most marriages here are negotiated, with an eye toward land, labour, and the practical alliance of 2 households rather than toward anything a later century would call romance. That the arrangement produced, over 15 years, something that does resemble affection, a comfortable, unglamorous fondness built from thousands of shared mornings, is not something either of them would think to remark on. It is simply how the marriage turned out, which they both, privately, consider a piece of good fortune. Ketil is 38, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who has spent 2 decades rowing against tide and hauling nets, quieter than his wife, content to let her manage the household's daily decisions while he manages the boats, the livestock, and the long list of physical labour that keeps a farm like this from sliding slowly into ruin. Between them they have 2 living children, though Thorhild carried 4 pregnancies to term, a ratio that this household, like every household on this coast, understands without needing it explained, and grieves privately, in the quiet way people grieve things they have learned they cannot control. Bjorn is 10, all elbows and restless energy, old enough now to go out in the boat with his father most mornings and actually useful there, not merely tolerated. And proud of that fact in the specific, slightly insufferable way of a boy who has only recently graduated from being underfoot to being needed. Asa is 6, still mostly attached to her mother's side during the working day, but already capable with a drop spindle for a child her age, already able to name every plant along the path to the spring and what each one is good for. Because in this household, as in most, education is not a separate activity scheduled apart from life. It is simply life, absorbed through hours of standing next to a working adult and watching, then being handed smaller and smaller tasks, until one day the child realizes she has become competent without ever being told she was being taught. Look closely at Thorhild for a moment before we move on, because the popular imagination tends to dress people from this century either in furs and horns or in a kind of generic sackcloth, and neither picture is accurate. She wears a long woolen underdress dyed a soft, unremarkable brown from local plant matter, belted at the waist with a woven band. and over it a shorter overdress held at the shoulders by a pair of simple bronze brooches, each one connected to the other by a short chain from which a small iron knife, a set of tweezers, and a little bronze needle case hang. Tools she reaches for a dozen times a day without ever consciously registering that she is reaching for them. Her hair is worked into a single thick braid, practical rather than decorative, though Yrsa has more than once talked her into something more elaborate for a midsummer gathering. Kettle, for his part, wears a plain wool tunic over trousers bound at the shin with woven leggings, and a cloak, the very one whose 400 hours of labour we will return to shortly, fastened at one shoulder with a plainer iron pin, leaving his right arm free to work. And then there is Gunhild, Kettle's mother, 61 years old, which on this coast, in this century, makes her a genuine rarity. A woman who has outlived most of her own generation and now occupies the particular, honoured position reserved for those who survive long enough to become a household's living memory. Her hands, knotted now with joints that ache predictably before every change in weather, no longer manage the finer spinning work they once did, but her mind holds something arguably more valuable. 61 years of accumulated knowledge about this coastline, this climate, these waters, and the stories passed down from her own grandmother and hers before that. That this household will tell tonight, as they tell most nights, gathered around the same fire that has been burning, in one form or another, on this exact spot for 3 generations. Gunhild has been a widow for 9 years now, her husband lost to a fever-one hard winter rather than to anything a later century would find dramatic enough to write down, and she has never remarried, choosing instead to remain in this household as Kettle's mother and, in every practical sense, its second-most senior authority after Thorhild herself. She rarely speaks of her husband directly, but Thorhild has noticed over the years that Gunhild always chooses to sit facing the door on the anniversary of his death, a small private habit nobody has ever asked her to explain, and that she has never offered to. The household is not only these 5 people. There is Yrsa, 17, a distant cousin from Thorhild's side sent to this farm 2 years ago in an arrangement that trades her labour for training in household management before her own eventual marriage, and there is Finn, a free labourer in his 20s who works this farm's land and boats in exchange for a share of the harvest and a place by this same fire, bound to the household not by blood but by contract, and, increasingly, by the kind of loyalty that develops between people who have hauled the same nets through the same cold water often enough to trust each other with their lives. 7 people then, plus the animals in the byre, all sheltering under one turf roof, all dependent, in the end, on the same harvest, the same catch, the same fire. None of this household owns a calendar in any form you would recognize, and yet every single person in it, down to 6-year-old Asa, carries an extremely precise sense of where the year currently stands. They read it from the height of the sun at midday, from the specific blue-grey colour the fjord takes on in the weeks before the first real frost, from the return of specific migratory birds to the skerries each spring, from the state of the grass on the roof overhead. Thorhild could tell you, without hesitation, how many weeks remain before the sheep need moving to their winter grazing, how many days of decent weather this stretch of coast typically allows for the autumn hay before the rains close in, and roughly when, within a handful of days, the light will grow short enough that the household's evening work will need to shift entirely to firelight. This is the household's true schedule, carried in nobody's hand and written on no page, and it governs Thorhild's year with a precision that would put most modern planners to shame. Finn came to this household 5 years ago, under circumstances the family rarely discusses openly, having lost his own parents' small farm 2 fjords north to a poor run of harvests that left the land unable to support even a single working adult. He arrived with almost nothing beyond his own 2 hands and a genuine willingness to work. And Kettle, who had grown up hearing his own father describe a similarly hard early stretch of life, took him on without much deliberation. an act of plain, practical generosity that Finn has spent 5 years quietly repaying through consistently excellent work and an easy warmth that has made him, in every sense except blood, family. He still sends a portion of his earned share north twice a year to a widowed aunt who could not take him in herself, but who wrote to check on him faithfully every season regardless. A small act of loyalty this household respects without ever needing to comment on it directly. If you want one detail that makes Thorhild feel like an actual person to you rather than a category, a representative of her century, consider this. She talks to the family's smallest boat. Not the 2 larger vessels Kettle and Finn take out for the serious fishing, but the little rowboat kept mainly for crossing to the small skerry where the household's sheep graze half the year, safely away from wolves. She has done this since she was a girl on her own family's farm. A private habit she has never fully explained even to Kettle. A low, murmured conversation conducted while she rows, addressed to the boat itself as though it were a slightly dim but well-meaning old friend. She would be faintly embarrassed if anyone caught her at it. Everyone in the household has caught her at it, repeatedly, over 15 years, and nobody has ever once mentioned it to her, out of a kind of tenderness that never gets spoken aloud either. Kettle, for his part, carries a private opinion of his own, one he has voiced aloud perhaps twice in 15 years of marriage and otherwise keeps entirely to himself. He believes, quietly and with real conviction, that the little skerry where the household's sheep graze half the year is a truly beautiful place, more beautiful than anywhere else he has ever rowed to, and that he would happily spend an entire afternoon doing nothing there at all if the farm's demands ever allowed such a thing, which they never quite do. He has never described this feeling to anyone in words much beyond a low, satisfied grunt on the rare mornings he rows out there alone to check on the flock. But Thorhild, who has watched him return from those mornings looking faintly, uncharacteristically peaceful, worked out the truth of it years ago and has simply never mentioned that she knows. Today has been what this household would consider entirely ordinary, and that ordinariness is precisely the point of spending an evening here. Kettle and Bjorn took the larger boat out before dawn to check the fish traps set along the skerries and to run a few lines beyond them, weather permitting, which it mostly did, aside from a squall that blew through around mid-morning and sent them briefly for the shelter of a small inlet. Thorhild and Yrsa spent the day between the byre, the spring, and the wool that has been drying since yesterday's washing, while Asa trailed between them, underfoot in the specific, useful way of small children who believe themselves to be helping and are, in fact, mostly helping. Gunhild sat for most of the afternoon just outside the longhouse door in the last of the summer light, working a piece of carding by feel more than sight these days, and keeping half an eye on a pot that needed occasional stirring. Nothing about today will be remembered as remarkable by anyone who lived it. And that is exactly why it deserves 13 centuries of our attention tonight. Because history, the actual texture of most human lives across most of human time, is built overwhelmingly from days exactly like this one, and we so rarely get the chance to sit inside one and watch it happen. The morning in this household begins in full darkness, well before any hint of light softens the sky above the fjord, and it begins with sound rather than sight. First, the low, patient creak of the byre partition as one of the cows shifts against it. Then, closer, the soft rustle of straw and wool blankets as Thorhild wakes on the raised sleeping bench she shares with Kettle, wakes the way she has woken nearly every morning for 15 years, with her body already anticipating the cold before her mind has fully caught up to consciousness. She does not linger in the warmth of the bedding, tempting as that would be with the hearth fire reduced overnight to a bed of grey ash and a few stubborn orange coals. The first task of every single day in this household, performed without exception in sickness and in the depths of winter alike, is coaxing that fire back to life, because a longhouse without fire is a longhouse rapidly losing the only thing standing between its occupants and a real dangerous cold. Thorhild kneels at the long central hearth, breathes gently across the coals until a thread of smoke curls upward, feeds in first the smallest, driest kindling she kept aside precisely for this purpose the night before, and waits, patient in a way that speaks to 15 years of repetition, until a proper flame catches and she can add the thicker peat that will burn slow and steady through the coming hours. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely if you think about it for more than a moment. There is no match in this world. There is no easy flame at the flick of a finger. Fire, once lost entirely, has to be rebuilt from a flint and steel and a great deal of patient effort, or borrowed at real inconvenience from a neighboring farm's hearth. Which is precisely why nobody in this household ever, under any circumstances, lets the fire actually go out. The coals are banked carefully every single night specifically, so they survive until morning, a small act of forethought repeated so many thousands of times across a lifetime that it has become as automatic as breathing and as essential. With the fire restored, Thorhild moves to wake the household in the order that the day's work demands. Kettle first, because the tide and the fish traps do not wait on anyone's convenience. And a boat that leaves an hour late might return with half the catch it would have brought an hour earlier. Bjorn next, roused with the firm patience reserved for a 10-year-old who would, given the choice, sleep another hour every single day of his life. Yrsa is generally already stirring on her own by this point, young enough to still be a naturally deep sleeper, but old enough to have absorbed the household's rhythms into her own body. Asa and Gunhild wake last, the two ends of the household's age spectrum, granted the small mercy of a few extra minutes that nobody has ever explicitly decided to grant them. It simply happens that way, every morning, and everyone understands why without anyone needing to say it. Breakfast, such as it is, comes together quickly and without ceremony. Last night's barley porridge, thickened further overnight in its bronze cauldron, gets reheated over the now properly burning fire, and portions are ladled out into individual wooden bowls, eaten standing or seated on the long benches that run along both walls of the main room. There might be a piece of dried fish alongside it, tough and intensely flavored, torn apart with fingers rather than any utensil, or a small measure of skyr, a thick, tangy, soured milk product that this household, like most along this coast, keeps constantly in production. A technology for turning perishable milk into something that survives considerably longer. Nobody lingers over this meal. It exists to fuel the morning's labor, not to be savored, and within perhaps 20 minutes the bowls are set aside for later washing and the actual work of the day has already begun. Here is where the popular image most people carry around in their heads, a Norway of grim warriors bristling with weapons, quietly and completely fails to describe what is actually happening on this morning, or on almost any morning across this entire century along this coastline. What is happening is Ketil and Bjorn checking the ropes on their boat and discussing, in the unhurried, half-mumbled shorthand of people who have had the same conversation 1,000 times before, whether the wind favours the northern fish traps or the ones closer in toward the skerries. What is happening is Thorhild pulling on a heavier outer layer against the morning chill and heading, with a wooden pail in each hand, toward the byre to milk the household's 3 cows and its handful of goats. A task that will take the better part of an hour and that she performs, this morning as every morning, with her forehead pressed lightly against a cow's warm flank, a posture of practiced intimacy between a woman and an animal she has tended for 6 years. Each of the household's cows has a name, given years ago and used constantly, spoken to almost as often as any human member of the household. The eldest, a patient, broad-backed animal well into her productive years, answers, in whatever limited way a cow can be said to answer anything, to a name that translates roughly to something like steady one. A name Thorhild chose specifically because it described the animal's temperament from the very first week she arrived on this farm. The goats, quicker and considerably more opinionated, get less formal individual attention, but are known collectively by Asa, who has appointed herself their unofficial supervisor. Well enough that she can identify each one by sight from a distance most adults in the household would need a second look to manage. The buyer itself deserves a moment of attention, because the arrangement, animals sheltering under the same roof as the humans who depend on them, tells you something important about how this household actually thinks about survival. It is not sentimentality that puts a cow within 20 feet of a sleeping 6-year-old. It is a hard-won understanding that in a climate capable of truly lethal cold, shared body heat is not a luxury. It is infrastructure, and the smell that a modern visitor might find overwhelming, that thick, warm animal smell mixing with peat smoke and drying wool, is, to everyone who actually lives here, simply the smell of a well-run farm doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Once the milking is finished and the pails carried through to the section of the longhouse set aside for dairy processing, Thorhild's morning branches into the dozens smaller tasks that never quite make it into anyone's romantic imagining of the past. Because nobody writes epic poetry about churning butter or checking a cheese for the right degree of firmness, and yet these tasks, performed with real skill and real judgment, are what keeps 7 people and a buyer full of animals fed through a winter that gives this coastline, most years, less than 6 hours of proper daylight at its darkest point. Asa, meanwhile, has been given her own small morning assignment, gathering eggs from the handful of hens that roost in a corner of the byre, a task she performs with the intense, slightly self-important focus of a small child who has recently been trusted with a real job for the first time. She counts the eggs out loud each morning to no one at all, a habit her mother finds quietly delightful and has never once discouraged. Down at the shore, the fog from the previous evening has burned off into a pale, high overcast, and Kettle and Bjorn push their boat out into water that still carries the night's chill, oars biting into a surface just beginning to catch the grey morning light. The work here is methodical rather than dramatic. Fish traps, woven from willow and staked into the shallows near the skerries, need checking and resetting. Lines baited the previous evening need hauling in, hand over hand. The catch, mostly cod and coalfish this time of year, unhooked and stowed in the bottom of the boat, while Bjorn, whose job this has become over the past year, keeps the growing pile organized and periodically bails water that has worked its way through the hull's overlapping planks. The cod come up heavy and cold, silvery along the belly, darker along the back, thrashing briefly against the boat's bottom boards before going still, and Bjorn has long since stopped flinching at the small violence of it, understanding, the way every child on this coast eventually understands, that this ordinary morning labour is precisely what keeps his family fed through months when nothing else will. A coalfish comes up tangled with a smaller catch Kettle calls, without much ceremony, simply bait, tossed back or set aside for the crab traps depending on its size. Gulls track the boat the entire time, wheeling and calling overhead in a constant, familiar racket that neither father nor son pays much attention to anymore. Background noise as unremarkable to them as traffic would be to someone raised in a city. There is a rhythm to this work that neither Kettle nor his son would think to call peaceful, because peaceful implies a contrast with something more chaotic, and for both of them this steady, repetitive labour simply is what mornings are. But it would strike almost anyone from a later century, watching from a boat alongside them, as something close to meditative. The dip and pull of the oars, the steady slap of small waves against clinker-built planking, the gulls working the water nearby, diving for whatever the fishing disturbs. 2 people, father and son, working in a silence that is not awkward or empty, but simply comfortable. The kind of quiet that only develops between people who have spent years learning each other's rhythms well enough that words have mostly become unnecessary. Finn, meanwhile, has taken the morning for a task that has been waiting on decent weather for the better part of a week, restacking and returfing a section of the byre's outer wall where last winter's frost worked a gap wide enough to worry Kettle every time the wind came from the north. It is unglamorous, physically demanding work, prying up old turf blocks gone thin and root-bound, cutting fresh ones from a patch of hillside set aside specifically for this purpose, fitting them into place root-side down the same way the roof above them was built, packing the seams with clay worked soft in a wooden trough kept just for this job. Finn works alone through most of the morning, humming some tuneless private thing to himself the way he often does, and by the time the sun has climbed as high as this coastline's overcast sky ever really allows it to climb, the wall stands solid again, ready for whatever the coming winter decides to test it with. It is nearing mid-morning now, and the household's various threads of work have all found their groove. Yrsa has taken over the wool that was set out to dry yesterday, carding it with a pair of wooden paddles studded with iron teeth, working the raw, greasy fleece into something approaching an even, aligned mass that can eventually be spun. Gunhild, seated just outside the longhouse door in a patch of weak sunlight that has finally broken through the overcast, works a smaller portion of that same wool by hand, her fingers slower than they once were, but her attention undiminished, and beside her, close enough to hear every word without appearing to be listening for it, Asa sits with her own small drop spindle, imitating her grandmother's motions with the fierce concentration of a child determined to master something that looks, from the outside, deceptively simple. This is a good moment to correct something the modern imagination almost always gets wrong about this century and this coastline. The word most people reach for when picturing Scandinavia in this era is Viking, and the image that word conjures, longships bristling with armed men, crossing open water with violence as the explicit purpose of the voyage, belongs to a period that has not yet begun and will not begin for roughly 90 more years. The people living on this fjord tonight have never seen a sail, have no concept of raiding as an economic strategy, and would find the entire idea, if you could somehow explain it to them, bewildering rather than familiar. What they actually spend their lives doing, morning after morning, year after year, is precisely what we are watching them do right now. Farming, fishing, spinning wool. Trading quietly with neighboring farms and, occasionally, with traders who arrive from further south, carrying goods from places these people have only heard described second-hand. The raiding, when it eventually comes, will be the exception that gets remembered by later centuries, not the rule these people actually lived by. The rule was this: a cow being milked, a child learning to spin, a father and son checking fish traps in the grey morning light. By the time the sun, such as it is under this coastline's characteristically overcast skies, has climbed to somewhere near its highest point, Thorhild has moved from the dairy work into preparing what this household considers its main meal, and it is worth pausing on this fact for a moment, because it tells you something about how differently this century organizes its day compared to your own. There is no clock here, no shared, standardized notion of noon as a specific measurable hour. Time is read instead from the sun's position, from the tide, from the specific quality of light filtering through smoke inside the longhouse, and the household's rhythms bend around these natural markers rather than around any mechanical schedule. When the light and the hunger and the accumulated fatigue of a morning's labor all arrive at roughly the same point, that is when the household eats. And that moment, on this day, has just arrived. Let us pause the morning here for a moment and talk about something that touches everything we have been watching, because it is easy to underestimate just how much labor, how much accumulated human effort sits behind a single piece of clothing in this household, and understanding it properly changes how you see every scene we visit for the rest of tonight. A single wool cloak, the kind Ketil wears out on the water most mornings, represents something in the range of 400 to 500 hours of human labor by the time it is finished, and that number is worth sitting with, because it means a single garment can represent more hours of concentrated effort than a modern person spends at their entire job across 3 solid months. Consider what actually has to happen before anyone can wear that cloak. Sheep have to be raised, fed, and protected through a full year, sheared once the weather allows, their fleece sorted by quality and color. because different parts of a single animal's coat produce noticeably different grades of wool. The fleece then has to be washed, an unglamorous, water-heavy process that removes the natural grease called lanolin, though this household has no name for the substance beyond simply understanding, through generations of practical experience, exactly how much of it needs to stay in the fibre to make it workable, and how much needs to come out. After washing comes carding, the paddlework Yrsa was doing this morning, which aligns the individual wool fibres so they can be drawn out evenly during spinning. Spinning itself, performed on a simple drop spindle, a weighted wooden shaft that a skilled spinner sets rotating with a flick of the wrist while drawing fibre from a bundle held in the other hand, is difficult to master and slow to execute, even for someone as practiced as Thorhild or Gunhild. A single spindle, worked steadily for an hour, might produce only a modest length of usable yarn. To produce enough yarn for a single cloak requires dozens of hours of this exact repetitive motion, performed in whatever spare moments the day's other labour allows, which is precisely why you will see wool spinning happening constantly in this household, during conversation, during storytelling, during nearly every quiet moment that does not demand a person's full hands, because the work simply never stops long enough to be treated as a discrete task rather than a constant background hum running underneath everything else. Once enough yarn exists, it still has to be woven, on an upright loom weighted at the bottom with fired clay or stone weights, a slow, standing labour that produces cloth at a rate of perhaps an inch or two of finished width per hour of steady work, depending on the complexity of the weave. And only after all of that, the raising, the shearing, the washing, the carding, the spinning, the weaving, does anyone finally cut and sew the resulting cloth into an actual garment, adding still more hours to a total that, added up honestly, genuinely does climb toward 1,000 hours for a single well-made cloak. Wool is not the only material in this household carrying this kind of hidden cost, and the numbers are worth pausing over, because they explain a great deal about what this family actually values and why. Take the iron in Ketil's knife, the same knife that hangs from Thorhild's belt chain and the larger one Finn uses to clean the day's catch. None of it arrives in this household ready-made. Somewhere inland, bog iron, a low-grade ore that forms naturally in certain wetland soils, has to be gathered, dried, and roasted in a charcoal-fired furnace tended for the better part of a full day just to produce a small, impure lump of usable metal called a bloom. That bloom then has to be worked and reworked by a smith, hammered and folded and heated again over hours of skilled labour, before it becomes a blade worth carrying. A single iron axe head traded down this coast from a smith perhaps 2 days' journey inland might cost this household the better part of a season's worth of dried fish or a significant length of finished wool cloth, which is precisely why tools here get sharpened, repaired, and passed down rather than replaced, and why a lost knife represents a genuine, aching loss rather than a minor inconvenience. Grain tells a similar story, though a quieter one, because it happens every single day rather than once in a great while. The household's barley does not arrive as flour. It arrives as grain, threshed by hand from the previous autumn's harvest, and every batch of porridge Thorhild prepares first requires someone, usually Yrsa on the days Thorhild is occupied elsewhere, to kneel at a rotary quern, a pair of flat stones the size of a large dinner plate, and grind the grain by hand, turning the upper stone against the lower one, feeding in small handfuls of barley and working steadily until enough coarse flour has accumulated for the next meal. A single person, grinding steadily, might take the better part of an hour to produce enough flour for 1 day's porridge for this household, and that hour happens every single day, without exception, because there is no way to grind a week's worth in advance without the flour spoiling. It is repetitive, physically demanding work, hard on the wrists and the lower back. And it falls, in this household as in most, to the women and older girls, one more thread in the enormous, largely invisible labor that keeps everyone else fed. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you actually sit with it. There is no coined money changing hands on this coast, but there is a very precise, very real sense of value running through every single object in this longhouse. A value measured not in abstract price, but in hours of somebody's actual life. A length of finished wool cloth might be traded further south along the coast for a soapstone cooking vessel quarried and carved by specialists who do nothing else. Vessels valued precisely because they can sit directly in a fire without cracking, unlike the more fragile clay alternatives some inland communities still rely on. Amber gathered from certain beaches after autumn storms might travel through a chain of hands stretching further than anyone in this household has ever personally traveled, toward markets on the European mainland, exchanged eventually for goods that will filter back north in the opposite direction. Glass beads, perhaps, or an especially fine whetstone. Weighed silver, when it appears at all this far north and this early in the period, functions less like modern currency and more like another tradable commodity, valued by its actual weight rather than by any stamped authority, cut and reweighed as needed to settle a given exchange. For Thorhild, this means the cloth in this household is never ever treated as disposable. A garment gets mended, patched, and eventually cut down into something smaller for a child, or repurposed as blanket lining, or used as padding, long after a modern eye would have consigned it to a rag pile. Every single scrap represents labor that somebody in this household actually performed, hour by hour, and wasting it would mean wasting months of somebody's life. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely, because it means the quiet, constant spinning you will hear happening around this fire tonight is not some picturesque, decorative habit. It is one of the most economically essential activities this entire household performs, arguably as important to its survival as the fishing itself, and it falls, almost entirely, on the women. The midday meal, when it finally comes together, gathers the whole working household around the central hearth for what amounts to the only real pause most of them will take between dawn and dusk. Kettle and Bjorn have returned from the water by now. The boat pulled up, and the morning's catch already split between what will be eaten fresh today and what Thorhild and Yrsa will spend part of the afternoon splitting, salting, and hanging to dry against the leaner months ahead. Finn has come in from whatever section of the farm's boundary wall he has spent the morning repairing, and even Gunhild, whose pace has slowed considerably from what it once was, makes her way inside to join the rest at the long benches. The meal itself is unfussy but truly substantial. More of the barley porridge, this time enriched with whatever dried berries the household set aside during last autumn's gathering, the tartness of the berries cutting through the porridge's plain. Grainy sweetness in a way that delights Asa especially, judging by how thoroughly she scrapes her bowl. Fresh fish today, some of it simply set to cook over the fire's edge on a flat stone. The smell of it filling the longhouse's smoky interior with something sharper and more immediate than the ever-present background scent of peat. A portion of skyer, tangy and thick, spooned out and eaten plain or occasionally sweetened with a small measure of honey that the household trades for rather than produces itself. Honey being one of the genuine luxuries available along this coast, harvested from wild colonies rather than kept ones, and rationed accordingly. Conversation over this meal runs mostly to practical matters, the state of the fish traps, whether the wool drying outside will need bringing in before the afternoon's weather turns, a bit of news Finn picked up from a neighbouring farm about a trading boat expected within the week. But there is also real laughter here. Bjorn recounting some minor drama from the morning's fishing with the exaggerated flair of a 10-year-old convinced his own stories are considerably more dramatic than they actually are. Thorhild's dry, understated response drawing a real laugh even from the normally quiet kettle. This is a household, not merely a labour arrangement, and the affection between its members, while never discussed in the terms a later century might use, is completely evident in exactly this kind of unremarkable midday exchange. That trading boat Finn mentioned turns out not to be a week away after all. It rounds the headland at the fjord's mouth not long after the midday meal has finished, a slightly larger vessel than the household's own boats, riding low with cargo, and its arrival draws Kettle and Finn down to the shore along with 2 men from the neighbouring farm, who spot it at almost the same moment. The trader, a weathered man Kettle has done business with perhaps 4 or 5 times over the years, though never often enough to call him a friend, exactly, carries soapstone vessels from further south, a small supply of the salt this household depends on for preserving its catch, and, tucked carefully among the rest, a handful of glass beads that have travelled, by the trader's own account, through so many hands and so many transactions that even he could not tell you their ultimate origin with any confidence, only that they came, eventually, from somewhere far to the south where such things are apparently made in quantities this household finds difficult to properly picture. This is worth pausing over because it corrects something the popular imagination gets consistently wrong about this coastline in this era. The common assumption pictures a scattered handful of isolated farms cut off from the wider world, each household surviving in something close to total self-sufficiency. The reality, evident in exactly this ordinary afternoon transaction, is considerably more connected than that. Salt from evaporation works further south. Soapstone from specialist quarries, glass beads that began their journey somewhere on the European mainland and passed through more hands than anyone here could count before ending up, today, exchanged for a portion of last week's dried fish and a length of Yrsa's finished wool. Thorhild has never travelled further than perhaps 2 days' journey from the farm where she was born, and yet the objects passing through her hands this very afternoon connect her, however faintly, to a surprisingly wide network of exchange stretching far beyond anything she could locate on a map. Mostly because she has never seen a map and would have no real need for one. Kettle trades a portion of the household's surplus dried fish and a coil of rope Finn made over the winter for a fresh block of salt, and, after some unhurried back and forth that both men seem to enjoy as much as the actual transaction, 2 of the glass beads, which he will hand to Thorhild without ceremony this evening, understanding correctly that she will find some quiet, private pleasure in them regardless of how she reacts in the moment. The trader stays only long enough to share what news he is carrying: a marriage 2 fjords north, a disagreement over grazing rights settled at the local assembly, nothing that touches this household directly, before pushing off again to make the most of what daylight remains. After the meal, the afternoon's labour resumes its own shape, distinct from the morning's rhythms. Kettle and Finn turn their attention to boat maintenance today, checking the caulking between the overlapping planks of the smaller vessel and replacing a section that has begun to weep water at a worrying rate. Work that demands real skill with tools and a genuine understanding of how wood behaves when it has spent years alternating between soaked and dry. Thorhild and Yrsa move the morning's catch of fish into the salting and drying process that will preserve it through the coming winter. Splitting each fish open, packing it with salt traded from further along the coast where evaporation ponds make the process viable, and hanging the results from wooden racks set up specifically for this purpose. Racks that will, within days, be thick with the strong, unmistakable smell of drying cod, a smell that this household finds not unpleasant, but simply, entirely the smell of security against the winter to come. Let us step back from this household's afternoon for a while and look at something that shapes almost everything we have watched so far, because the rules governing how these people understand their world, their health, their obligations to each other and to forces they cannot see, run underneath every single task we have described tonight, whether anyone in this longhouse would think to name those rules explicitly or not. This is a world without formal medicine in any sense a modern person would recognize, and it is worth being honest about what that actually means, rather than romanticizing it. Life expectancy at birth across this century and this region sat considerably lower than it does in almost any part of the modern world. not primarily because adults died young once they survived early childhood, but because childhood itself was truly dangerous. A significant portion of children born on this coast, and Thorhild's own 4 pregnancies against 2 surviving children, reflects this reality with painful directness, did not survive their first several years, carried off by infections and illnesses that a modern clinic would treat as routine. Childbirth itself carried real, substantial risk for the mother as well as the child. Managed with whatever accumulated practical knowledge the household's women held, herbal remedies passed down through generations, the assistance of whichever woman on the fjord had the most experience attending births. And, underneath all of it, a clear-eyed acceptance of risk that this household would never think to describe as fatalism, simply as the honest shape of the world they lived in. We should be careful here about what we actually know versus what we are reconstructing, because that distinction matters, and a good historian should never blur it. These people left us no written accounts of their own beliefs, no diary entries, no letters. What we know about their spiritual life comes instead from archaeological evidence, grave goods that suggest beliefs about an afterlife, place names that preserve references to spirits associated with specific natural features, and from written sources recorded considerably later, sometimes centuries later, by people describing traditions that had likely already shifted and evolved by the time anyone wrote them down. When we describe the household gathering tonight to hear stories about spirits in the mountains and the sea, we are reconstructing a probable spiritual world from these fragments, not reciting a text these people themselves would have recognized word for word. What does seem well supported by the archaeological and later written record is a worldview in which the landscape itself was considered inhabited, not merely by the visible plants and animals, but by unseen presences tied to specific places. A particular waterfall might house a spirit that needed to be shown respect. A stretch of forest might be understood as belonging, in some sense, to beings that predated any human claim on the land. The sea itself, given how directly this household's survival depended on it, almost certainly carried its own layer of respected, occasionally feared presence, something that later written traditions would develop into named figures governing storms and safe passage. Whether this household used names for these presences that a later century would recognize is genuinely uncertain. What seems much more certain is that they held some version of this basic framework, a world where the visible and the unseen sat close together, and where showing proper respect to both was simply part of living safely on this land and this water. We do have one genuine written source that touches this exact region, though it comes from almost 200 years after tonight and from an unexpected direction entirely. A man named Othere, a chieftain from further north along this same coast, eventually sailed south to the court of King Alfred of Wessex in England and gave a first-hand account of his homeland. Its farming, its trade in walrus ivory and furs, its long winters, an account an English scribe wrote down and which survives, remarkably, to this day. Othere lived generations after Thorhild's household and considerably further north, and his account describes a somewhat wealthier, more travelled existence than an ordinary coastal farm like this one would have known. But the underlying rhythms he describes, cattle, sheep, fishing, trade goods moving along the coast from hand to hand, would have been entirely recognizable to Kettle, and it is one of the few times in this era that a voice from this part of the world reaches us at all, even second-hand, even through a foreign scribe's pen. Everything else we have reconstructed tonight comes from the patient, careful work of archaeologists reading longhouse foundations, midden heaps, and grave goods the way you or I might read a letter. Health, more broadly, was managed through an accumulated body of practical knowledge that deserves considerably more credit than popular imagination usually grants it. This household understands which plants growing along the path to the spring have genuine medicinal properties, knowledge Asa is already absorbing simply by walking that path repeatedly at her mother's side. Wounds are cleaned, bound, and monitored with real attentiveness. Broken bones are set and splinted by people who have watched the process performed successfully many times before. None of this constitutes medicine in a modern clinical sense, but dismissing it as mere superstition badly undersells the genuine, hard-won practical competence involved. Competence built from generations of careful observation rather than from anything resembling controlled experimentation. But competence, nonetheless. We can say some of this with genuine confidence because of what skeletons themselves reveal once archaeologists learned to read them properly. Bones from graves across this period show us people generally shorter than the modern average, though not dramatically so, their teeth often worn down flatter and faster than a modern dentist would expect. A direct consequence of stone-ground flour that inevitably carried tiny fragments of grit from the quernstones themselves. Grit that wore away tooth enamel meal after meal, year after year, until a person in what we would consider late middle age might have teeth ground down close to the gum line. Chemical analysis of bone collagen. A technique this household could never have imagined, but one that speaks almost directly across the centuries on their behalf, tells us a great deal about diet. Confirming a life built substantially around fish protein, along exactly this stretch of coast, alongside dairy and grain, precisely the diet we have been describing at Thorhild's table tonight. None of this is guesswork dressed up as certainty. It is measurement, careful and specific, performed on the actual remains of people who once lived lives very much like the one we have spent this evening inside. There is more to understand here about how a household like this one thinks about status and obligation, because the social world of this fjord, while considerably less rigid than the more stratified societies that will eventually develop across Scandinavia, is not without its own hierarchy. Free households like this one own their own land and answer to no lord in any formal sense, but they exist within a web of reciprocal obligation to neighboring farms and, increasingly across this period, to more powerful families who are beginning to accumulate the kind of wealth and followers that will eventually harden into the chieftain structures of the coming Viking age. The Leka ship burial we mentioned earlier belongs to exactly this emerging pattern, evidence of a family somewhere along this coast who had already, by this point in history, gathered enough wealth and enough followers to justify a funeral on a scale ordinary households like Thorhild's would never approach. That family's rising prominence sits somewhere in the background of this household's world, a fact of local politics rather than a daily concern, but a genuine thread of the same tapestry we are examining tonight. Now, here is where most people get something else about this era badly wrong. The popular image of women in this world tends to run in one of two directions, either quietly invisible, background figures with no real authority, or, in a more recent overcorrection, warrior figures lifted wholesale from later legend. The actual picture, reconstructed carefully from later law codes that almost certainly preserve older custom, and from burial evidence showing women interred with keys, the literal symbol of household authority, alongside their other grave goods, sits somewhere more interesting than either extreme. A free woman in a household like this one could own property in her own right, could initiate a divorce under circumstances a great many later European legal systems would not have permitted for centuries afterward, and held, as Thorhild plainly does, genuine day-to-day authority over the household's operation, a fact her husband would confirm without a trace of defensiveness if you asked him directly. None of this made her his equal in every legal or social sense a modern reader might hope for. But it made her considerably more than the silent background presence popular imagination often assumes, and it is worth remembering, the next time you picture this era, that the actual balance of power inside a longhouse like this one was worked out day by day, argument by argument, compromise by compromise, exactly the way it is inside most households in most centuries, including your own. Disputes among free households like this one, the kind of grazing disagreement the trader mentioned this afternoon, are not generally settled by any single ruling authority, because no such authority yet exists in the form later centuries will develop. Instead, farmers across a district gather periodically at an open-air assembly, a custom that later written sources call the Thing, where disputes are argued aloud before the community and settled through a combination of precedent, negotiation, and the accumulated social pressure of neighbors who all have to keep living beside each other afterward. Reputation matters enormously in a world organized this way. A household known for fair dealing, for honoring its word, for generosity toward neighbors in a lean year, accumulates a kind of social wealth that proves truly valuable when a dispute eventually needs settling in its favor, and Ketil, quiet as he is, has spent 2 decades building exactly this kind of reputation. One unremarkable, honest transaction at a time. The afternoon has worn on, and the light along this fjord, never especially bright even at its peak this time of year, has begun the slow shift toward evening that will eventually bring us back to where we started. A household gathering around its central fire as the fog rolls in once more off the water. It is 4:15 in the afternoon, and the household's various tasks have begun folding back toward the longhouse rather than spreading outward across the farm. The way water eventually finds its way back to the sea, regardless of how far the tide carried it out. Ketil and Finn have finished the boat's caulking and turned their attention to a section of the stone wall marking the farm's boundary with its northern neighbor. A wall that needs constant, patient maintenance against the slow work of frost heave and wandering livestock. Thorhild has finished the day's salting and moved on to checking the household's stores, a running mental inventory she keeps with the kind of precision that would put many modern spreadsheets to shame, counting dried fish, measuring remaining grain, and quietly calculating whether this winter's preparations are keeping pace with where they need to be by this point in the season. Gunhild and Asa, meanwhile, have taken on the afternoon's quieter task of stacking dried peat near the longhouse door, close enough at hand that nobody will need to trudge out into a winter storm to fetch fuel for the fire. Asa treats this as a game more than a chore, building small, precarious peat towers that inevitably collapse to her own delighted laughter before Gunhild gently redirects her back toward the actual, more stable stacking pattern the task requires. Near the drying racks close by, the strong, unmistakable smell of the fish salted 2 days earlier has fully set in now, sharp and briny. Carried on whatever faint breeze manages to work its way up from the water, a smell that will only grow stronger over the coming days and that this household has long since stopped registering as anything other than reassuring. Bjorn, released from his morning's fishing duties and not yet needed for the evening's work, has claimed a rare hour of genuine free time, which he spends the way most 10-year-olds along this coast spend such hours, down at the water's edge with a neighboring farm's boy named Steinar, roughly his own age and, by unspoken agreement between the two boys, his closest thing to a best friend on this stretch of coast. The two of them spend a good portion of the hour throwing smooth stones across the fjord's calmer stretches and arguing, with real intensity, about whose throw travelled further, before Steinar produces, with some ceremony, a small carved wooden boat his own father whittled for him over the winter. And the two boys spend the rest of the hour racing it against a twin of driftwood along a shallow, slow-moving stretch of the shoreline, narrating an entirely invented sea voyage for their little fleet complete with storms, sea monsters borrowed loosely from Gunhild's own stories, and a triumphant homecoming that Bjorn insists on reenacting twice because he is not satisfied with how dramatically he delivered it the first time. This kind of unstructured childhood freedom, brief as it is within a day otherwise organized entirely around labor, matters enormously to how this household understands what a good childhood looks like, and it would surprise many modern people to learn how much space this era actually carved out for exactly this kind of play, even within lives that demanded real, substantial work from children as young as 5 or 6. Asa, meanwhile, has attached herself to Gunhild for the afternoon. The two of them settled just inside the longhouse doorway where the light is best, Gunhild working her carding paddles by feel and long habit, while Asa peppers her with the specific, relentless questions of a 6-year-old who has recently discovered that her grandmother appears to know the answer to literally everything. Today's line of questioning concerns the mountains visible, on clear days, beyond the fjord's far shore. And whether anything actually lives up there, a question Gunhild answers with the careful, unhurried patience of a woman who understands that how you answer a child's questions about the world shapes what kind of relationship that child grows up having with it. Now, here is where most people get this part of the picture badly wrong, imagining childhood in this century as either brutally harsh, all labor and no tenderness, or, in an overcorrection, as some idealized natural innocence untouched by hardship. Neither picture holds up against what we can actually reconstruct. Asa works hard every single day, gathering eggs, learning to spin, absorbing the household's rhythms through direct participation rather than formal instruction. But she is also, unmistakably, adored, teased gently, told stories, allowed real unstructured time, and raised by an entire household of adults who each, in their own way, invest real attention in her development. Bjorn faces genuine physical risk every morning he steps into a boat on cold water, risk his parents are entirely aware of and have simply, out of necessity, learned to hold alongside their love for him rather than letting it paralyze either the family's livelihood or their affection. This is neither a harsh world nor a soft one. It is simply a world, complicated and specific, the way every era actually is once you look closely enough to stop reducing it to a single mood. The light is fading now in earnest, the pale overcast of the afternoon deepening toward the same grey dusk and rolling fog that greeted us at the very start of this evening, and the household's separate threads of afternoon labour have begun, one by one, to draw back together. This is the hour when a longhouse like this one starts, almost without anyone consciously deciding it, to turn inward toward the fire, toward each other, toward the kind of closeness that only really happens once the working day's demands have finally released their grip. The heavy wooden door groans on its leather hinges as Ketil ducks through it, Finn a step behind him, both men bringing with them the cold, damp smell of the evening air, a smell that will linger on their clothes even after they have settled close to the fire. Inside, the contrast hits immediately and completely, the way it always does at this hour, the outside world's raw, grey chill giving way to a warmth that feels almost solid, thick with peat smoke and the low, steady orange light of a fire that Thorhild has over the course of the afternoon. Built back up from its daytime simmer into something more substantial, ready to carry the household through the coming hours of darkness. This is one of the details that changes how you understand this entire way of life, if you sit with it for a moment. A longhouse in winter, or even on a damp autumn evening like this one, is not simply a shelter from the weather. It is an entire climate of its own, deliberately maintained, and stepping through that low doorway means crossing, in the space of a single stride, from a world of cold, wet, grey fog into a world of warmth, smoke, firelight, and the accumulated smells of a full day's cooking and living. The temperature difference alone would be substantial enough to notice immediately, but it is the density of it that really registers. The smoke hanging in visible layers near the roofline before finding its way out through the hole above the hearth. The warmth radiating not just from the fire itself, but from the packed bodies of livestock just beyond the byre partition. The smell of drying fish and wood smoke and wet wool steaming gently where it hangs near enough to the fire to dry without scorching. Thorhild has the evening meal well underway by the time everyone has gathered, and tonight it centres on the bronze cauldron that hangs, suspended by a chain, over the central hearth, filled with a barley porridge enriched, this evening, with dried herbs and a generous measure of the berries the household gathered and preserved during last autumn's harvest. The porridge simmers slowly, released small clouds of savoury steam that mix with the wood smoke, and its steady, low bubbling becomes, without anyone remarking on it, one of the evening's background sounds, as constant and unremarkable as the fire's own quiet crackle. Yrsa, spinning steadily, allows herself a private thought she has not shared with anyone in this household. that she is, in truth, looking forward to her own eventual marriage, and the household of her own it will eventually give her to run, not out of any dissatisfaction with her time here, which has been truly kind, but out of a simple, quiet ambition to prove she has learnt this craft well enough to manage it herself. She watches Thorhild the way an apprentice watches a master whose skill she hopes to match one day, and she has already, privately, begun keeping a mental list of small decisions she would make slightly differently, a list she would never dream of voicing aloud in this house, and that she treasures anyway, precisely because it is entirely her own. Yrsa has settled near the fire with her drop spindle, resuming the wool she carded earlier, and the steady sound of a spindle in use, a soft, rhythmic whir punctuated by the small tug of fibre being drawn out, joins the porridge's gentle bubbling as a second thread in the evening's quiet soundscape. Asa has taken up her own smaller spindle beside her, imitating Yrsa's motions with the fierce concentration she brings to everything, occasionally producing an actually usable length of yarn, more often producing something considerably lumpier, which nobody in the household ever criticizes, understanding correctly that competence here comes only through hundreds of hours of exactly this kind of imperfect practice. Gunhild has taken her customary seat closest to the fire, the seat this household has, without ever formally deciding it, reserved for her, both out of respect for her age and out of the practical recognition that her joints ache considerably less in the fire's direct warmth. She has set her carding aside for the evening, her hands, tired from the afternoon's work, resting quiet in her lap, and there is something in her posture, a certain stillness, that everyone in the household recognizes immediately. It means a story is coming. Bjorn notices it first, abandoning whatever he was doing near the door and settling onto the bench near his grandmother with the transparent eagerness of a child who has heard these stories dozens of times before and wants, desperately, to hear them again anyway. Asa follows a moment later, setting her spindle carefully aside, and even Finn, technically an adult with no real obligation to listen to a grandmother's stories, finds a reason to settle nearby, mending a piece of harness leather with his hands while his attention drifts, unmistakably, toward the fire. And this is the part of this evening, and honestly of this entire century, that rarely gets told with the attention it deserves, because when people imagine Scandinavia in this era, they picture ships and weapons and violence, and they almost never picture this. An elderly woman, her joints aching gently in the firelight, drawing a breath, and beginning, in the same unhurried voice she has used for this same purpose more times than she could count, to tell her grandchildren about the spirits believed to live in the deep water beyond the skerries, and about the giants said to make their homes in the high snow-covered peaks visible, on the clearest days, beyond the fjord's far shore. Gunhild's voice, when she tells these stories, drops into a particular register, lower and more measured than her ordinary speaking voice, a cadence clearly practiced and refined across decades of exactly this kind of evening telling. Tonight's story concerns a fisherman, a figure who exists in slightly different versions across every farm along this coast, who once rowed further out past the skerries than caution allowed, chasing a run of fish that seemed, that evening, too good to abandon, and who found his boat suddenly, inexplicably becalmed in water that should have carried a current strong enough to move him. The story describes, in Gunhild's careful telling, the fisherman's growing unease as the fog thickened around him exactly the way it is thickening around this longhouse right now, and the low, wordless singing he began to hear from somewhere beneath the water's surface, and how he understood, with the sudden clarity of someone remembering something his own grandmother had once told him, that he had rowed into water that belonged, in some sense, to something other than himself, and that the only sensible response was respect rather than fear, a quiet acknowledgement offered to the water itself, after which, and only after which, his boat began to move again. The children listened to this story the way children along this entire coast have listened to versions of it for generations. with the delicious mixture of genuine unease and complete safety that only works when the person telling the story is someone you trust absolutely and the fire beside you is burning warm and bright. Asa, halfway through the telling, has drifted close enough to lean her head against Gunhild's arm, her eyes heavy, fighting sleep in the specific way of a small child who wants very badly to hear the ending, but whose body has quietly begun making other plans. Outside, beyond the turf roof and its rising column of smoke, the fog has thickened into full darkness, and somewhere above that fog, invisible tonight but present nonetheless, stars have begun to emerge over water gone black, and still except for the small, patient waves folding themselves onto the beach below, over and over, exactly as they have every single night since long before this household existed, and will continue every single night long after it is gone. When Gunhild finishes the story, nobody rushes to fill the silence that follows it. This is itself a kind of ritual, unspoken but consistent, a few moments of quiet reflection before the evening's ordinary sounds, the crackle of the fire, the soft continuing whir of Yrsa's spindle, the low bubble of the porridge gently reassert themselves. It is Finn who eventually breaks it, asking Gunhild, as he does most evenings, whether she has ever actually seen anything like what the story describes, a question he asks not because he expects a new answer, but because the ritual of asking and receiving her familiar, careful response is itself part of what makes this evening feel complete. Gunhild's answer tonight is the same one she has given for years, delivered with the same small, private smile. She says that she has spent her whole life on water that could easily hold such things, and that a wise person does not need to see a thing directly to understand that respect costs nothing and its absence might cost everything. It is not quite a yes and not quite a no, and everyone in the household, including the children, seems to understand instinctively that this ambiguity is exactly the point. Asa, fighting her heavy eyes with the last of her determination, asks for one more, the short one, the one about the mountain, and Gunhild obliges, because this story is brief enough to fit before the porridge finishes and gentle enough to send a tired child the rest of the way towards sleep rather than pulling her back out of it. This story concerns the high peaks visible from the fjord on clear days, the ones Asa asked about only this afternoon, and the old belief that certain of those peaks are not simply rock and snow, but something closer to sleeping shapes, enormous and ancient, who have rested there so long that trees now grow across their shoulders and rivers run down through the creases of what might once have been an arm or a knee. Gunhild tells it the way she always does, without any hint of alarm in her voice, describing how a shepherd once lost a handful of sheep high on the slopes during a sudden fog, much like tonight's, and how he found them again, unharmed, curled for warmth against something broad and dark and very slowly breathing, which he had the good sense not to disturb, backing away instead with his sheep gathered quietly around him, and a story to tell that his grandchildren's grandchildren would still be telling long after he was gone. There is no danger in this version of the tale, no punishment, no violence, only a shepherd's quiet good sense rewarded with his sheep returned safely, and that is precisely why Gunhild chose it for this hour. Asa is asleep, or very nearly, before the story even properly finishes, her head heavy against her grandmother's arm. And Gunhild lets her voice trail gently, rather than pushing all the way to whatever ending she might have given the tale on a livelier evening. The porridge is ready now, and the household settles into the evening meal with the same unhurried closeness that has defined this entire fireside hour. Bowls are filled and passed, conversation resumes in low, comfortable tones, Bjorn recounting, with rather less enthusiasm than usual now that sleep is beginning to tug at him too, some detail from the afternoon stone-throwing contest with the neighbour's boy. There is laughter, quiet but real, when Yrsa teases Finn gently about a piece of harness leather he has been mending, by her account, for considerably longer than the actual repair should require, and Finn's mock offence at the accusation. This is the peaceful unity that this household and dozens of others scattered along this same fjord tonight would recognize as simply an ordinary evening, unremarkable in every way except in how completely it satisfies the basic human needs that sit underneath every single culture across every single century. Warmth, food, the company of people who know you well and choose, night after night, to remain close to you anyway. A story that connects the present moment to everyone who has sat by this same fire before, stretching back further than even Gunhild's memory reaches. As the meal winds down and the fire settles into the steady, undemanding burn that will carry the household through the next several hours, the evening's pace slows further still. Yrsa's spindle finally stills, her hands tired, the day's yarn coiled and set aside for tomorrow's weaving. Finn finishes his harness repair and sets it near the door, ready for morning. Kettle, who has said relatively little this entire evening, content as always to let the fire and his family's voices fill the space around him, reaches over at some point to bank the fire slightly lower. A small, wordless gesture that everyone in the household reads correctly as the evening's first signal that sleep is approaching. Above the hearth, through the smoke hole cut into the roof's ridge, sparks occasionally rise on a current of warm air, visible for just a moment against the darkness beyond before vanishing entirely. And if you tilted your head back at just the right moment, you might catch, through that same opening, a genuine glimpse of stars. The fog having thinned somewhat now that full night has settled in, cold and clear above the lingering mist that still clings low to the water. Bjorn is the first to actually fall properly asleep, still sitting upright on the bench near the fire, and it is Thorhild who notices. Crossing the room quietly to guide him toward the raised sleeping platform along the wall, layered with straw and heavy wool blankets and the household's collection of animal pelts, sheepskin mostly, soft and warm against the wood beneath. Asa has been asleep against Gunhild's arm for some time now, and Gunhild, moving with the slow, deliberate care of aching joints, transfers her granddaughter to the same sleeping platform with a gentleness that 15 years of practice has made entirely automatic. This is one of the quieter patterns worth noticing tonight. Easy to miss if you are only watching for the dramatic moments this century supposedly specializes in. The rustle of rushes and straw settling under small bodies, the soft sound of heavy wool being pulled up and tucked close, the low, wordless murmur of a grandmother's voice, no longer telling a story now, simply offering the last small reassurances that send a child properly into sleep. None of it will ever be recorded anywhere except in the accumulated pattern of 10,000 identical evenings across this coastline, and yet it is, in its own quiet way, exactly as real and exactly as significant as anything that will eventually happen on the decks of the ships this family's descendants have not yet built. The rest of the household follows within the hour, Yrsa and Finn to their own designated places along the sleeping platforms, Gunhild to the spot nearest the fire that the household has, again without formal decision, understood to be hers. And finally, Thorhild and Ketil, settling together on the platform they have shared for 15 years, close enough to the banked fire to catch its last warmth, but far enough that a stray spark presents no danger. Before sleep finally takes her, Thorhild does what she does most nights, a final, half-conscious inventory of the day just finished and the day about to begin, run through her mind without any need for ink or parchment. Because this household's entire operational memory lives in exactly this kind of nightly mental accounting, passed down and reinforced through repetition rather than written record. Tomorrow the fish need checking again. The wool Yrsa spun today needs weaving into the household's ongoing length of cloth. Gunhild mentioned, in passing, that her hip has been troubling her more than usual, worth watching. Small things, ordinary things, exactly the same category of concern that will occupy Thorhild's mind again tomorrow night, and the night after that, for as many years as this fjord continues to hold her family safely within its own unhurried rhythm. Let us stop the narrative here for a while and look at something larger than any single evening, because the world this household inhabits, peaceful and settled as it feels to everyone living inside it tonight, is standing closer to a genuine historical hinge point than any of them could possibly know. Change, across most of human history, rarely announces itself. It accumulates quietly, in small technological adjustments and slow shifts in social organization, until enough of it has gathered that later generations, looking back, can identify a moment when everything seems to have turned. For this coastline, that moment is still roughly 90 years away, but several of the changes that will eventually produce it are already, quietly, underway. Consider the boats. The vessels resting on this beach tonight, clinker-built and rowed rather than sailed, represent a remarkably sophisticated maritime technology refined over centuries of careful trial and adjustment. The Kvalsund boat, discovered by archaeologists in a Norwegian bog and dated to almost exactly this period, shows us this technology in remarkable detail. A hull built without a proper keel, meaning it could handle coastal and fjord waters beautifully, but would struggle badly in truly open ocean. Within the coming decades, Scandinavian shipbuilders will begin adding true keels to their vessels, a change that sounds modest but proves transformative, because a keeled hull can carry a mast and a sail without capsizing. And a sail changes everything about what distances a boat can realistically cross. The ships that will eventually carry this family's grandchildren and great-grandchildren across open water to England, to Ireland, eventually to Iceland and beyond, do not exist yet. But the slow, patient engineering work that will eventually produce them is already happening in boatyards up and down this same coastline. A quiet accumulation of small improvements that nobody involved would recognize as historically significant. Because from the inside, it never looks like anything more than one boat builder trying to solve a practical problem slightly better than the boat builder before him managed to. Consider also the question of wealth and power. The Leka ship burial we mentioned earlier, the discovery that in some sense inspired this entire evening's visit, reflects a broader pattern archaeologists have identified across this exact period, a slow but unmistakable concentration of wealth and status into fewer, more powerful hands. Most households along this coast, Thorhild's included, remain what we would call middling farmers, free but unremarkable. But scattered among them, increasingly, are families accumulating enough surplus, enough followers, enough prestige goods traded up from the European mainland to begin functioning as something closer to local chieftains. Figures who will, across the coming decades, gather the resources, the ships, and eventually the ambition that historians will later associate with the earliest Viking raids. That mound on Leka carries its own small, strange story worth pausing over. Centuries after tonight, a medieval saga writer would record a legend about a king named Herlorg, said to have shut himself inside a burial mound on this very island rather than submit to a rival's growing power. A story later generations treated as colourful myth layered onto an old pile of earth. Only very recently, using modern carbon dating on material recovered from that same mound, have archaeologists shown that whoever was actually buried there was laid to rest considerably earlier than any king the saga could have been describing. Sometime in this same narrow window around the year 700, decades before the political world the legend assumes had even come into existence, the saga, it turns out, attached a memorable story to a mound that was already old and half forgotten by the time anyone wrote the story down. Which tells us something quietly humbling about how history gets passed along. Even the people writing things down, centuries closer to the truth than we are, could still get the date wrong by generations. And it took patient modern science, not inherited memory, to finally set the record straight. Thorhild's household has no meaningful relationship with whatever family lies buried in that mound on Leka. But the same broad economic currents that allowed one family to accumulate enough wealth for a ship burial are the same currents running quietly beneath this household's own life. Currents neither Thorhild nor Ketil would have any language to describe. Because from inside a single ordinary life, broad historical currents simply look like the ordinary texture of the world as it has always been. There is also, worth noting honestly, a slow but real growth in population pressure across this period, farms subdividing across generations as more children survive to adulthood than the available land can comfortably support. A demographic reality that historians increasingly believe played a genuine role in eventually pushing Scandinavian communities toward expansion, whether through peaceful settlement of new land or, later, through the raids and eventual colonization that would define the coming centuries. None of this touches this household directly tonight, but their own children, Bjorn and Asa, will grow up inside exactly this slow building pressure, and their own eventual choices about land, marriage, and opportunity will be shaped by forces already quietly gathering strength along this entire coastline while their parents sleep tonight, entirely unaware. Bjorn, asleep now under his wool and fur on the sleeping platform where his mother settled him, will live to see the very beginning of what later centuries call the Viking Age. An old man himself by then, and there is no way to know from here, watching him sleep tonight at 10 years old, what he will make of the world his own sons and grandsons choose to build within it. Perhaps a grandson takes one of the new keeled ships west and never returns. One name among the thousands the sagas and church chronicles will eventually record on the receiving end of a raid. Perhaps the family stays exactly as it always has, farming and fishing this same stretch of coast for another dozen generations, while history's more dramatic chapters play out somewhere else entirely, which was, statistically, the far more likely outcome for almost any family on this coast, however little space that quieter outcome occupies in how we tend to remember this era now. Either way, Bjorn will die without ever knowing which future his descendants chose, the same way none of us, drifting off tonight, can know which of our own choices our great-grandchildren will eventually judge as history, and which will simply be forgotten, the way most choices in most lives always are. Consider, too, the slow drift of religion, moving toward this coastline from the south at a pace so gradual that nobody alive tonight will ever notice it arriving. Far to the south, across the water this household will never personally cross, Christian kingdoms have existed for centuries already, and the trade goods passing through Ketil's hands this very afternoon, the glass beads, the occasional coin melted down for its silver, have already touched, however briefly, a Christian world Thorhild has no name for and no reason yet to think about. It will be another 300 years, roughly, before missionaries and kings begin the long, often violent process of formally converting Norway, and Gunhild's stories about spirits in the mountains and the sea will, by then, have been driven underground, preserved only in folklore and place names, rather than told openly around a hearth like this one. None of that touches this household tonight. Gunhild will finish her life exactly as she began it, and her grandchildren, and very likely her great-grandchildren too, will grow up hearing the same stories she is telling right now. The old world lasting, in this corner of the coast, considerably longer than the more dramatic turning points of history might lead you to expect. The craft of iron working is shifting too, quietly, in blacksmiths' workshops scattered along this coast, as smiths steadily refine techniques for folding and layering steel that will, within a few generations, produce blades of a quality this household's simple tools cannot currently match. This is not happening because anyone has decided, in advance, to arm a future generation of raiders. It is happening the way most technological change happens, through countless individual smiths, each trying to make a slightly better axe head than the one before. Each small improvement passed to an apprentice, refined again, passed onward, only looking backward, the way we are looking tonight, does this steady accumulation of small improvements in ships and blades and organization start to resemble the deliberate assembly of something. From inside it, It was never anything more than people getting incrementally better at their own trades, the way people in every century, including your own, quietly do. What is genuinely remarkable and worth sitting with for a moment is how completely invisible all of this remains from inside the life we have spent this evening watching. Thorhild will never know that she is living through what later historians will identify as the final peaceful generation before an entirely new chapter of her people's history begins. She experiences tonight, and every night like it, simply as an ordinary evening, indistinguishable in kind from 10,000 others stretching back through her mother's life and her grandmother's before that. This is, perhaps, one of the most honest things history can teach us. Almost nobody in any century experiences their own moment as a hinge point. They experience it, overwhelmingly, as simply Tuesday. The pattern only becomes visible from a great distance, looking backward, the way we are looking backward at this fjord tonight. Let us step back now from this single evening and consider what the whole of this day, morning through night, actually reveals, because a household like Thorhild's, examined closely enough, tells us something true not just about Norway in the year 700, but about the deep, recurring patterns of ordinary human life across most of history. The first pattern worth naming is the sheer density of obligation that filled every single hour we watched today. There was no leisure in the modern sense scattered casually through this household's day, no stretches of time understood as belonging purely to rest or entertainment. Except for the brief, precious hour Bjorn claimed at the water's edge and the quiet fireside evening that closed the day. Nearly everything else, the milking, the fishing, the spinning, the salting, the wall repair, existed because the household's survival actually depended on it being done, and being done well, by people who understood, without needing it explained, that a single season of neglected labor could mean genuine hunger by the following winter. This density of obligation is not unique to this century or this coastline. It describes, in fact, the overwhelming majority of human lives across the overwhelming majority of human history, and it is worth remembering. The next time modern life feels demanding, how recent and how remarkably rare our own relative abundance of unstructured time actually is. The second pattern is the near-total invisibility of women's labor within any traditional accounting of what this century supposedly accomplished. If you asked most people to describe what happened in Scandinavia in the 8th century, you would get ships, raids, kings, and warriors, and you would get almost nothing about the 400 to 500 hours of labor behind a single cloak, or the daily, unglamorous competence required to keep a household of 7 people and a byre full of animals fed through an 8-month winter. Thorhild's actual daily labor, spinning, weaving, dairy production, food preservation, and household management was not peripheral to this society's survival. It was, arguably, every bit as essential as the fishing and farming more commonly associated with this era, and yet it is precisely the kind of labor that history, told carelessly, simply forgets to mention, because it left behind no swords, no burial mounds, nothing that photographs well in a museum case. The third pattern is the genuine sophistication hiding inside what looks, from a distance, like simplicity. A drop spindle looks, to modern eyes, like a child's toy. A turf roof looks, at first glance, like a primitive shelter rather than a carefully engineered climate system. A story about spirits in deep water looks, if you are not paying attention, like superstition rather than what it actually was. A sophisticated cultural technology for teaching children genuine, life-saving caution around a truly dangerous body of water, wrapped in a form memorable enough that a 6-year-old would actually retain the lesson. Nearly everything we watch tonight, examined closely, reveals far more embedded skill and accumulated knowledge than the popular imagination generally credits to this era. And this pattern, the tendency to underestimate the sophistication of people who lived without writing or metal cities, is one worth carrying forward into how you think about every historical period you encounter from now on. A fourth pattern, Closely related is the sheer weight this household places on memory as a technology in its own right. In a world with no writing to lean on, Gunhild's story tonight was not simply entertainment. It was a compressed, memorable package of real, practical information about currents, about caution, about respecting a body of water capable of killing a careless fisherman, delivered in a form specifically built to be remembered by a tired 6-year-old and passed down again, one day, in her own voice, to children not yet born. The household's entire sense of the calendar works the same way, carried in nobody's hand, recorded on no page, held instead in the accumulated shared attention of everyone from Gunhild down to Asa. We tend to assume, from inside a world saturated with written and recorded information, that a culture without writing is somehow operating with less. Spend one evening actually watching how much this household reliably remembers and carries forward and passes on with genuine accuracy, and that assumption starts to look considerably less certain than it did before we came here. The fifth pattern is the household as the fundamental unit of survival, considerably more central to this era's actual social structure than any king, chieftain, or eventual Viking expedition. Thorhild's household did not exist in service of some larger political project. It existed, first and entirely, to keep its own 7 members and their animals alive and reasonably comfortable through another year, and every single decision we watched today, from the order in which people were woken, to the careful rationing of honey, to the constant, unglamorous maintenance of tools and buildings, flowed directly from that basic, unromantic priority. The grander historical narratives, the rise of chieftains, the coming Viking Age, the eventual Christianization of Scandinavia centuries later, all of it happened, in the end, on top of millions of individual household days that looked almost exactly like the one we spent tonight. And arguably it is these ordinary household days, not the dramatic events layered above them, that actually constituted most people's lived experience of history as it was actually happening. And the sixth pattern, perhaps the quietest but the one most worth carrying with you as you drift towards sleep tonight, is the sheer continuity of basic human need across an almost unimaginable span of time. Strip away the specific technology, the wool cloaks and clinker-built boats and turf roofs, and what remains is something that would be instantly recognizable to you. A mother waking before dawn to keep her family warm and fed. Children learning their world through patient imitation of the adults they trust. An elder's stories, offered at exactly the hour when a tired child needs both comfort and something to occupy a drifting mind. A fire, banked carefully every single night, specifically so the people gathered around it will wake. Tomorrow, to something like warmth and safety rather than cold and uncertainty. 13 centuries separate you from this household, and almost everything about the world we have visited tonight would feel, to you, entirely foreign. And yet the underlying shape of what this family wanted, safety, warmth, the closeness of people who love them, a story at the end of a long day, would need no translation at all. Taken together, these patterns describe something worth holding on to long after tonight's story ends. History, told well, is rarely about the loudest events a century produced. It is about households like this one, doing the quiet, competent work of staying alive and staying close to each other, generation after generation, while the louder events that eventually get written down happen, mostly somewhere else, to someone else, and only occasionally, almost by accident, reach all the way down into an ordinary evening like the one we have spent watching Thorhild and her family live. The fire has burned down to a low, steady bed of red coals by now, giving off just enough light to trace the outline of the sleeping platforms along the walls, the shapes of Bjorn and Asa curled together under their heavy wool blankets, Gunhild still, slow breathing near the hearth's remaining warmth. Yrsa and Finn settled on their own platforms across the room, and Thorhild and Ketil, close together, both finally fully asleep after a day that asked everything of them and, in its own quiet way, gave them everything they actually needed in return. Before sleep finally claimed her, Thorhild did one more small thing, the kind of thing that never makes it into any account of this century and yet matters enormously to the person doing it. She took the 2 glass beads Ketil traded for that afternoon and pressed them, briefly, between her palms, feeling their strange, smooth coolness, a texture unlike anything else in this longhouse, unlike wool or wood or stone or bone, before tucking them carefully into a small pouch she keeps tied at her waist even while sleeping. She has no real use for them. She will likely never wear them, not being the sort of woman drawn to obvious display. But there is a quiet, private pleasure in simply possessing something so unlike her ordinary world, something that travelled so far to end up, however briefly, in her hands, and she falls asleep with that small pleasure still faintly present. The last conscious thought of a very long day. Outside, past the turf roof and the last thread of rising smoke, a wind has picked up from the northwest, moving gently through the stand of pine and spruce that shelters this farm's uphill side, a low, steady whisper of a sound, neither harsh nor unpleasant, the kind of sound that has likely never once fully woken anyone sleeping in this longhouse, only threaded itself into their dreams as something safe and familiar. Beneath that whisper, fainter, more constant, comes the sound of the fjord itself, small waves still finding the shore in the dark. The same unhurried rhythm that greeted us at the very start of this evening and that will greet whoever wakes first tomorrow morning, long before the sky above the water has any real light in it at all. Beyond that wind and that water, the fog has settled fully over the fjord now, thick and undisturbed, and beneath it the water continues its patient work against the shore, small waves folding themselves onto smooth stones in a rhythm that has no beginning this household could name, and, as far as any of them know, no ending they will ever witness. Somewhere out past the skerries, a bird calls once, briefly, and falls silent again. The cows shift quietly in the byre, and the peat smoke, thinner now that the fire has been banked so low, rises through the roof's small opening and loses itself, the way it does every single night, in the darkness gathered above this one small, warm, well-loved home. Tomorrow will ask this household to do almost everything again. The fire will need waking before dawn, the same patient coaxing from ash and coal into proper flame. The cows will need milking. Ketil and Bjorn will take the boat out again, checking the same traps, hauling the same lines, and Thorhild will move through the same sequence of dairy and wool and food preservation that has structured nearly every day of her adult life. There is no notebook here recording tomorrow's obligations, no written schedule waiting to be consulted in the morning light. This household carries its entire future inside memory and habit alone, and somehow, night after night, year after year, that has proven to be enough. The day is already, in some sense, beginning again before tonight has quite finished, the way it always does, the way it will keep doing for this family and for their children and for their children's children, long after every one of us listening tonight has closed our own eyes. The house is quiet now. The fjord is dark. Somewhere out there, in a world neither Thorhild nor Ketil nor Gunhild will ever see, ships are still 90 years from being built, raids are still 90 years from being sailed, and none of that matters here. Tonight, where a family sleeps soundly beside a fire that has been kept alive, one careful ember at a time, for 3 generations. Tomorrow begins before tonight has quite finished, the way it always does. But that is tomorrow's story. For now, sleep well.